Hi there.
Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. If everybody could just really make sure and check their microphones, please. We want to make sure everybody's on mute. So we're going to wait a few minutes until more folks jump on.
If you want to make cast iron pizza like this in the public, it's super easy to make. It's a pan, fluffy, crunchy, and fried. Choose the edges. Struggle it down.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're just waiting for a few folks to come on, and please just make sure that your microphone is on mute. Thanks, guys. All right, it is 2:03. We are going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join our webinar series today. We are super excited to launch a 7-part series about emergency all hazards, around the country. Of course, this is going to have a big emphasis on the southern states from Florida to Louisiana, Texas. Dealing with hurricanes, as well as what happens with rodent emergencies and sheltering of pets and of people as well. So, and then we're going to wrap up the session, and at the very end of this, we'll give you the schedule of the future trainings and webinars. But we're also going to be giving, we've pulled on some of our colleagues across the Gulf states to give us their experience. For example, what's happened a few years ago in Fort Myers with the hurricane. So we're pretty excited to include all of these topics. So hurricane season is literally around the corner. So we want to make sure that everyone really has a great understanding of the public health component and how important it is to be organized and things that you need to be doing now so that you're prepared for when these emergencies occur. So today I'm really excited to introduce Mr. Richard Chatman. He's the Deputy Director of the New Orleans Office of Coordination and Emergency Management. He has 25 years of experience spanning emergency management, public safety, and executive leadership, both in Portland, Oregon, and here in New Orleans. He's led emergency coordination operations during complex, high-profile responses, including the Super Bowl events, the Bourbon Street terror attack, major hurricane activations, and large-scale civic events. He focuses on modernizing emergency management systems, strengthening community resilience, and integrating economic recovery into disaster planning. And also, he previously served in crisis communication and executive roles with the Portland Mayor's Office as a fire lieutenant paramedic with the Portland Fire and Rescue. So today we're super excited to have him. He's going to talk about the EOC and what is it. So Richard, thanks so much for taking the time, and I'm turning it over to you.
All right, thanks, Claudia. First of all, I would just like to thank Claudia and her team at the Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board for inviting us to come deliver this information. Anytime we get a chance to talk about what it is we do, I'd like to capitalize on that opportunity. As she mentioned, I'm Deputy Director of NOCEM. That's the New Orleans Office of Coordination and Emergency Management. I'm just hoping that today we have a good discussion about what the EOC is, the Emergency Operations Center that we run, and what we do and how you guys fit into the big model of emergency management. So our goal is really to kind of show you the cycle of everything we do within a year and demonstrate how it's not just during the emergency that emergency management becomes relevant, and your role in the planning effort that we make year round. So we're going to talk a lot about planning. If you want to have a fun little internet rabbit hole event, look for quotes on planning, because there's some really great ones out there. Some of them really funny. Some of them are just really great things to remember about planning. I thought this one was great because it's simple. It says a goal without a plan is just a wish, and it was written by a pilot/writer in the 1920s when flying planes was much more dangerous than it is today, about specifically how important it was to make sure that planning involved the fuel and the navigation routes and the other planes that were going to be in the air when they didn't have the command and control elements that we have today. So I thought that was kind of an interesting quote, but we'll get right into our plan for the day here. So this is the stuff we're going to cover over the next hour. And as you kind of look through these different 6 elements, the first 4 is really the foundation of how we manage either major events or major emergencies, unplanned emergencies. And so we're going to talk about what NOCEM does, what our role is in coordinating everything. We're going to talk about the EOC and what its role is and how you can be a part of it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the language that we use with emergency support functions, community lifelines. And then I realize not all of you are in the vector world, but I think you guys are all in the health system world. So whatever piece of the health system that you work in applies just as well to that 5th point there on where vector control fits into the emergency management spectrum. And then we're going to talk a little bit about BioWatch, which is a very specific category that some of you may have some awareness of, but we'll talk a little bit about it. So just recently, our office was renamed from the New Orleans Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness to the New Orleans Office of Coordination and Emergency Management. And it was very purposeful, the mayor's decision to name us the way she did, coordination being at the forefront there, because that really is a large part of what we do. We coordinate things. We don't run emergencies, we coordinate them. And that's an important distinction that you'll hear throughout the presentation today. A little bit about just kind of the overall structure. We're the office that is in place for readiness. It's our responsibility to make sure all the departments in the city are ready and prepared, and that they've got their plans, that they've had an opportunity to train on them. We set up exercises so that we can test those plans. When we have an incident, we manage the after action review to make sure that we stuck to the plan. The mayor ultimately is responsible for the safety of the city of New Orleans. And so she delegates that work to us, but ultimately the decisions to do things like evacuations are decisions that the mayor makes. And then we have a plan that kind of overall is a playbook for how we operate during emergencies. And we call that the Comprehensive Emergency Operations Plan. And we're going to take a look at some of the plans that we use in the Emergency Operations Center, and you'll see how all the different pieces when it comes to health and safety are actually named in those plans. And there's a seat for you in the Emergency Operations Center. And this is a little bit about the 4 phases. So one big misconception I think that people have about emergency management is that we are a response organization. And while that is correct in some ways, we just look for opportunities to educate people on the fact that we don't have fire trucks. We don't have any kind of actual field problem-solving tools at the end of the day. We're here literally to support the folks that do. So we support the police department. We support the fire department in managing especially incidents that are such a large scale that they can't handle that incident on their own. So we have 4 phases to our year-round cycle of dealing with emergencies. First one starts with mitigation. And that's basically how we work with planners and city departments to actually physically change the conditions of our city to make it so that those emergencies or those disasters have less impact. The second phase there is preparedness. This is the plans that we write. This is the exercises that we do. These are all the things that we do to make sure that everybody's ready for whatever emergencies we anticipate we will have in the year. And then when it comes to response, we have the EOC, and EOC stands for Emergency Operations Center. That's kind of the beehive where we get all of the representatives from all these different departments to basically help us solve the problem and to deal with the little things that come up. Because essentially, big problems can be broken down into a bunch of little problems at the end of the day. So if you're kind of following at the bottom of the slide there, it's showing what that may look like for a particular group like vector control. Back to the mitigation phase, it's talking about source reduction. And we actually help out with getting messages out to the public to try and reduce that to increase that source reduction. The preparedness piece, routine surveillance and drills is something that is definitely a part of the vector control world. And so that is the preparedness function that they focus on. And then when it comes to response, in the case of vector control, Claudia and I were just talking about the helicopter that they use for abatement. And that's an excellent tool that we have here in New Orleans. But also there's a role for vector control in our Emergency Operations Center. So anytime folks actually have an active role during disasters and emergencies, we want a representative from that department to be in the Emergency Operations Center with us so that we can help them with their planning of how they plan or how they're responding to the incident. What we don't do is take over any kind of command and control of their operation. We only provide support and help with that planning piece. And then the last piece is recovery. And this is really kind of the whole reason why we're here. And we try to keep that really in the forefront of our operations in the EOC is we are working towards recovery. We want to get the city back up and running. We want to get the city machine up and running. We want to see businesses back open. And we want all the departments to be able to return to their normal duties. So that's the goal that we set for ourselves. when we convene in the EOC to work together. Claudia, are we allowing for questions?
Yes, we allow people to put questions in the chat and you
Okay.
can answer at the end.
Okay, all right, perfect. I won't be able to actively look at the chat, but Stacia, if you see something that maybe I need to answer in the middle of this, just give me a shout. All right, so moving on here. A term you'll hear a lot of in emergency management in this whole world, and many of you may already be familiar with these terms, blue sky versus gray sky. And probably pretty easy to figure out what we're getting at there. We have two real modes that we operate in. We have a blue sky mode and we have a gray sky mode. And that gray sky mode is talking about the actual incident when it's happening. And the blue sky mode is really where we focus a lot of our efforts. This is the area where we make those connections with folks like yourselves. You know, we want to make sure that we've got good contact lists for who to reach out when we have an incident develop, who's going to come into our EOC, who can we get trained on how EOC operations work before they even come to the EOC. So the connection piece that I really want to focus on with that is it is so vitally important that we get to know each other during those blue sky modes, and being available for exercises that we conduct for the training in the EOC, so that you know how to function and you know kind of what the expectations are in the EOC. All that stuff needs to be done in that blue sky phase, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can plug into your local OEM, whether it's us or in one of the other parishes around. Okay, and so we talked a little bit about the fact that we don't take over the incident. We don't take over the response that the individual departments are having. If you're in vector control, we're not telling you guys how to manage rodent control or mosquito abatement. But what we will do is help you be successful in that work that you're doing. And so we use what's called a incident management system. This is a system that's been developed over years. It's proven to be the most effective system when it comes to managing a lot of different components for one big problem that we're trying to solve. We use that system, and as part of that system, the way things play out is we use what's called a crisis action team. As soon as we understand that there is something developing, whether it's a storm, whether it's maybe a response to the heat that we're dealing with, or extreme cold, whatever the case may be, what we do is we assemble a small team of folks from here in the office and from the departments like the ones you guys work in, to look at the problem, project how soon or how big of a problem it's going to be, and what kind of response we're going to need to deal with it. There we go. So when it comes to this emergency operations center, one slide I meant to get on here was diagram of the room. I don't think I've got it on here. But essentially, when you come into the EOC, what you will see is one massive screen that is broken down into 4 squares. Our goal in the Emergency Operations Center is to provide a clear operating picture of the problem. So we have multiple screens throughout the room, and things that you'll see up there are, you know, some of the weather channel. Maybe if we're dealing with a hurricane, you'll see some of the weather channel displays, you know, their active weather reports. We'll see one of the screens will cover the 26 sensors that we have distributed around the city that provide active information about what kind of rainfall rates that we're having, what kind of wind that we're seeing, just some really critical information when it comes to looking at weather. And we can look at it at a very granular level. We can see street flooding now through a couple different ways. We have flood sensors under some of the underpasses or some of the more extreme underpasses, those ones that we see get flooded and watch on TV as someone tries to drive through and gets themselves in a lot of trouble. We also have some new technology that is really kind of groundbreaking stuff. There's a system called Hi-Fi. It's a group of sensors all around the city that uses a laser technology basically to provide an image to us of where there is street flooding around the city. And these are the kind of things that we try to present up on the screen so that we can all get a good idea of what the operating picture is that we're looking at during the incident. Beyond that, there's a few things though that I think it's important to emphasize that is not done in the EOC, and we've already kind of covered it a couple times throughout our discussion here, and that is, this is not where we run the incident. This is not how we somehow, supersede the authority of any of the professional departments that are there working on the incident with us. It is a place where we take information though that you're able to provide. We assemble it into SITREP reports, and we send that out to several different contacts throughout the city. And so our goal is not only to keep the EOC informed and keep the operators on the ground informed, but also folks all over the city that may have different roles and maybe communicating to the public. And the goal is to make sure that everyone is looking at the same information. And so a lot of what we're doing is deconflicting competing information. Right. So the way we break things down in the EOC is by functions, essentially. And we break those functions down a few different ways. And this is one of them. So the kind of nuts and bolts of how we're solving the problem, that's our operations division. The folks who are constantly looking at what we need to solve the problems of tomorrow or even tonight, just keeping an eye as to making sure that we have the proper resources, whether it's people, whether it's water, food, whatever it may be, we call that planning. And then the ones that actually move stuff around for us and make sure that our reserves are in order so that we can fulfill the resource requests as the disaster plays out. That's our logistics division. That's our Amazon. And then also we have the folks who keep track of the money. And I know that that's a fairly important piece of this puzzle for all of us, is how we're going to fund our operations, especially because we're dealing oftentimes with federal reimbursements during Stafford declared disasters. It's important that we have that element there in the EOC to track what kind of expenditures you've been having, what kind of resources you've been dedicating to the emergency. So we've got a completely specific division to just that finance and admin piece. All right, we've got a few different levels that we do also when it comes to talking about activating the EOC. The kind of everyday posture that we have, the everyday activation level that we're at is a level 4. And that just means we're monitoring things. Nothing seems to be on the horizon. So, everything's gravy. When something starts to brew, when we first get that indication that there may be a problem developing somewhere, we just go ahead and raise that activation level to a level 3, and we start assembling that crisis action team that we're talking about. And this is where some of your departments could become involved in our operation. Is we may need a resident expert to help us inform us as to what exactly it is that we're looking at when it comes to these different emergencies. So this is why that, that connection to your OEM office and to the EOC is so important. Is we really need to have those contacts ahead of time that are reliable and able to help us out when the problem arises. In a lot of cases, it's going to be phone calls from you guys, from the folks that are assigned to the EOC, the liaisons, and potentially this crisis action team that are even going to alert us as to the fact that a problem is developing. Because on a lot of these things, we don't necessarily have eyes on. We depend on the departments. So once we've decided that we do have a problem that we're going to have to tackle here, it really depends on the scope of it. And so what we'll be looking at is, what kind of impact this problem is going to have on the city, and what kind of resources are we going to need to be able to manage it. And if we believe that it's only going to be a certain number of departments to manage this incident, then we'll go to a level 2, otherwise known as a partial activation, where we bring in the department that maybe has alerted us, a few departments that may be needed to help us mitigate the problem, and we'll just stick to that. Once we realize that the problem is big, this is the hurricane, this is when it comes to events, this is the Super Bowl, these are the really big events, the really big incidents, then we go to a level 1 full activation. And that is a preset liaison that we've got from every department that you can think of, really, from around the city. We bring in regional partners, we bring in partners from the state and federal, and so then that's when the machine is fully running, and we start a regular rhythm of meetings in the morning and sit reps that go out to all the stakeholders. And we have a system for making sure that we are covering all the needs that the city may see. And we're going to talk about that with the ESFs and lifelines. All right. Yeah. So when it comes to the types of things that we activate the EOC up for, there's really kind of 2 different categories there. We've got our scheduled events that we know we're going to have to be activated for. They're typically situations where there's going to be a lot of people in a short space, in a small space, and we just want to make sure that they stay safe, because there's obviously certain vulnerabilities that arise when you get a lot of people in one space. So things like Jazz Fest, Mardi Gras, Essence Festival, Super Bowl, large sporting events, sometimes even big concerts. Taylor Swift, when she came to town, we had to activate for all those nights. And just to kind of, give you an idea of why and when we activate, we don't activate for every concert. But in particular, when we had Taylor Swift here recently, there was information about some of her previous concerts that involved a threat. And because of that threat, then most cities that Taylor Swift was visiting did exactly like we did, and stood up the EOC, brought in a lot of law enforcement partners, and our EMS and fire partners, just to make sure that we have all the resources and all the voices in the room that we may need should something go bad during that event. Actually, just turned out to be one of the best weekends here in New Orleans. The nicest people I ever met. Okay, so our next subject here is kind of the battle rhythm of how things play out once we start the EOC, and we use that term battle rhythm really just to indicate that we have a preset system of how things operate. And we do that because we know that during emergencies, things are chaotic, and trying to create structure when you're taking in information about a chaotic incident that's happening is difficult. And so what we've done is we've written the script ahead of time. We've practiced it ahead of time. And we know almost just by second nature, as soon as that we get the EOC open, you know, there's priorities that we're going to have to take care of, and we knock them off like a checklist. We look at, do we need shifts? Is this thing going to have to go 24 hours? Because if so, we may not want the full team here from this office and some of your other offices here in the EOC. We need to break them up so that people are going to be prepared to come in and do the night shift. We start a regular rhythm of situation reports and establish, you know, who's going to receive those situation reports and confirm that we've got everybody covered. And then we'll also have to provide a mayor's briefing. Keeping the mayor informed at every stage is a really important role of ours, because ultimately that's what we're here for, is to keep the ultimate decision maker and the one responsible for everyone's safety informed. We create an incident action plan. So this is where we sit down with the departments that are actually mitigating the problem. And we take in information from each of them, how they're solving the problem, who is going to be out in the field. We want names and contact numbers and an ability to keep track of people, right? And we assemble all of that together into an incident action plan. And then also, we have a system for keeping track of everything, because as you can imagine, going through all of this throughout the day, multiple days in a row, and now once it's all said and done, we have to do an after action review and remember what it is we did last Tuesday, when quite frankly, I can barely remember what I did yesterday or this morning. That an important part of that is we log everything that we do into a digital system. It's called Web EOC, just keeps track of all the different details of the incident. And then also when we have resource requests, we want to track who did we ask for what did they provide, when did it happen, all of that. All right, so ESFs, essential support functions. This is a really important piece of how we break down the different elements that are going to support us during an incident. One of the kind of important things to kind of recognize is our structure in government is real apparent when you're dealing with especially federally declared disasters. You got your federal government, you've got your state government, and you have your local government. Sometimes in a lot of cities, they have to deal with a county or a parish government in between. Here in Orleans, we are a parish city, so we don't have that extra layer of government in between, which I actually think is really nice. But regardless, when we talk about getting funding from the federal government or getting any kind of resources from the federal government, they don't deliver that resource or those funds directly to us here in New Orleans. They have to go through the state. And so there's an office called GOSEP, the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, that we have a close relationship with, that they facilitate getting us whatever resources we would request from the federal government. And they also have a full team of people who come out to the different parishes. They sit in our EOCs and they work with our teams. And they facilitate that communication that happens between us and the state. All right, now we'll look at those ESFs. So here's a full rundown of all the essential support functions that we work with. And in particular, number 8 and number 11 are highlighted there because if you do work in vector control, this is the areas where you guys are going to be operating out of. Public health and medical emergencies are services, and agricultural and natural resources. The other essential support functions are how we separate out, though, the different teams within the EOC. And as you can imagine, transportation will have a representative from RTA. It'll also have a representative maybe from the state level from the Department of Transportation. Fitting. Our communications group, Public Works, firefighting, emergency management, mass care, and human services. And that's one in particular, mass care and human services, that sometimes teams up with number 8 there, public health and medical services. The two work together quite a bit. You can see all the different functions there. What that looks like when you walk into our EOC and most EOCs is each essential support function is maybe a row on a table, or in our case, what we do is we group those ESFs together and put them at a table. So in particular, like the mass care and human services, the public health and medical services, they combine at a table because a lot of their work is together, really. Only have ESFs. Now, personally, I like another system that's also used, and the two can be used together, and they're called community lifelines. And I think I'm just going to talk about community lifelines. No. So essentially, the breakdown of ESFs does have an even kind of higher arching way of looking at them, and that is kind of in 3 categories. We have our emergency services, you have your infrastructure, and you have your human services. And these are all the things that we do to just make sure that people are safe, right? The whole purpose of these ESFs, the whole purpose of breaking them down into 3 categories, and the next one you're going to see those community lifelines. All of those are really set up to make sure, are we providing our residents here in this city the basic services that they need to survive? Because essentially, when we look at emergencies, when we look at disasters, what actually affects people is a disruption in service. So if you're medically dependent, in whatever case, maybe you need oxygen, maybe you need a medication that you take every day, dialysis. There's several different ways that you can become dependent on these things. When there's a disruption in service, in other words, the pharmacy is no longer open, or we don't have power to keep your oxygen machine working, or we don't have the oxygen itself. These are the things that cause suffering, and in some cases, people to get really hurt or potentially die, and that's what we're here to prevent. So these checklists, these different systems, these diagrams, these all help us just kind of make sure we remember, are we covering everything here? All right. So the 2 lanes, like I mentioned before, that those of you do work in vector control would operate out of is here, number 8 and number 11, the public health and medical services, and then the agriculture and natural resources. So number 8 there, and it kind of talks about the scope that you guys are operating in there, with disease surveillance and investigation, containment of harmful health effects, laboratory coordination, and identifying biological hazards. So this is where all of the work that's done to keep the community and public educated on what the threat is and how they can help mitigate it. A lot of those messages are developed there in that group, the public health and medical services, ESF. And then the other kind of side of what you'd be looking at in vector control is animal and plant disease, pest response, food safety and security, animal care and sheltering. Those are all areas also where mosquito and rodent abatement is an important piece. And so you can kind of now wrap your mind around how this EOC is a big group of people, but what you're really seeing in that EOC is groups of people at tables solving problems, getting a clear picture from field reports of what we're dealing with, and looking at how we can use other departments there in the EOC to help solve the problems that we're looking at. Here, let's see, okay, there we go. All right. So this is the list of community lifelines that I mentioned before. And I like this one because it's so simple, and it's just really easy to wrap your mind around. These are essentially the elements that we are constantly checking on to make sure that we have supported in the field. And so these are really the elements that we'll send out in sit rep reports. You'll see basically a list of here's the update on safety and security. Here's the update on food, hydration, and shelter. Maybe we've stood up shelter operations somewhere. Health and medical issues, energy. Energy is a really important one because power disruption is a disruption in one of those basic services like we discussed that really cause problems. When you look at Hurricane Katrina, you look at Hurricane Ida and the impacts that we had during those. Hurricane Katrina obviously had a huge flooding element to it, but a lot of, why people died during that hurricane was that disruption in services. I came out here with a disaster medical team back in 2005. We stood up a medical triage and treatment operation at the old MSY airport. And so we had essentially like a MASH style hospital set up right in Concourse C. It was really quite the sight. But what we were doing was triaging patients that had been dropped off from buses that had picked up patients just elderly folks from an independent living facility or a nursing home, and brought them to the airport because they couldn't manage their care in a building that maybe had some flooding and definitely didn't have any power. Problem was, once they got to this medical triage and treatment situation that we had set up, is we didn't have power and very limited resources. So that disruption to those services that they depend on continued there in the airport in many cases, and we saw real tragedy happen there. So that's what we're here to prevent. We want to make sure that we get those basic services consistently to people, and so they don't have to suffer. So lifelines, when it comes to the vector control and what your priorities that you'll be managing in our EOC with us, health and medical, obviously, water systems. Claudia's always pushing our public communications branch to be getting messages out about how people at home can help with that abatement, especially when there's been heavy rain and puddling and such. And then also you'll be working with us to deal with the food, hydration, and shelter issues. So as soon as we set up a shelter somewhere, that's an element where we look for proactive people to be in that EOC with us, to hear that we're setting up a shelter, and immediately butt into that group and just provide some opportunities for us to educate folks in the shelter about how to keep rodents out, and how we can mitigate problems as they arise. Since we're not taking questions in between this, if you guys do have questions, I think Stacia mentioned it earlier, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or just keep them on your mind. And when we get to the end here, I'll leave a few minutes for us to look at those questions. So we talked a little bit about your important role already in the system, that whatever departments that you're working on in the health world are most likely already named in our plans. And it's true. We have plans. We have things like the emergency operation plan that I mentioned before. That's kind of the comprehensive, this is how you start the EOC. This is your responsibility if you're in these different departments. And we also have these things called desk books. And the desk books are actually for specific tables, maybe health and human services. There's a desk book of health and human services, and vector is mentioned in that desk book. I just looked at it last night to confirm that. So Claudia, we got to talk after this. We got to get you tied in a little bit better. This is the area actually where the Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board is mentioned. It's the ESF 11 in the checklist, and it talks about the duties, responsibilities of a liaison from the Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board. So whatever function you guys represent here, I guarantee you, if you're from here or you're working here in New Orleans, your office has a role with us, and it's important that we get connected and make sure that you guys have a liaison that reports to us. So we talked a little bit about the situation reports. The situation reports essentially are the method that we use to keep people informed. All right. And let's see here. Yeah, I'm gonna see. Boy, I'll be honest with you, I don't remember what I was getting at with that slide. We're going to move to this one here on the difference between, the departments being isolated and integrated. This is the whole reason why our office is here, is to make sure that you're integrated. And when it comes down to it, we know from history that when it comes to managing incidents like this, teams that have integrated components from a broad spectrum are able to manage events so much more successfully than those that work in isolated silos. Ultimately, when your department is forced to work a major problem on your own, you're working with limited information compared to what you can have working with us in the EOC. Ultimately, you're going to have to deal with things like hiring contractors and getting emergency contracts on your own in those cases, and that really isn't very effective. In the EOC, we have teams dedicated to those specific functions that are there literally just to support folks like yourself out in the field or in your kind of command and control elements. Okay, and so looking at vector control in particular, there's obviously a sequence of events that can be expected when it comes to that control, that vector control. And so essentially what is needed is a good recognition of how this is going to play out that can inform our planning and how we manage the incident. We know that within the first couple days of a hurricane, we're going to deal with a water problem, right? There's going to be wind and water. So not only do we have a lot of water, but we have a lot of water places where it doesn't normally exist because wind is blowing things around everywhere. Then when we get to that 3 and 7 days stage, now we're dealing with the fact that water's been sitting for long enough for those pesky little bugs to start laying their eggs and doing things. And that's about as technical as I'm going to get with the mosquitoes, Claudia, because as you know, I'm way out outside my realm there. But after that, now we start looking at week 2 and 3. Now is when we're dealing with the actual surge of mosquitoes. And so the reason why this is important information, especially for us in the EOC, is oftentimes we can have a misconception that we have solved many of our problems by week 2 after a hurricane. And what's really important from our vector folks is to make sure that the vector folks keep us informed of how this is developing, what we can expect, and why we need to continue our public messaging and our mitigation efforts. And look at the time here, we're at 2:50. Okay, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to kind of speed through these last few here. Data sharing. So a lot of also what we focus on in the EOC is capturing really relevant data, and making sure that we have that not only to keep that operating picture clear, but also to inform how we handle these in the future, right? And so the kind of data points that we're looking from, like our vector control folks, the trap counts, the areas treated and spray schedule, disease signals, the number of actual positive human cases that you've reported. And then also when it comes to that expense side, it's important that we keep track of the expenses and the contractors used and the amount of resources that you've dedicated to managing the incident to hopefully get you paid so you can continue to manage these incidents. So let's see here. This one talks a little bit about Hurricane Francine, which actually, Claudia, are you able to give the audience here any kind of just idea, based on what we're talking about here, how Hurricane Francine played out, how it looked?
Oh, Francine, which one's that one? Because I remember Ida. There's so many. So there's so many, but I don't remember Francine, but I remember Ida.
You know what? Tell us about Ida then. That's even better.
Okay, so let me tell you. So Ida, I think, is the big one that we remember. So Ida was 2021, I think.
Yep.
Right. So 2021, and so what happens when the water comes in, and for everybody on the call, we're going to have a whole hour, right, of just emergency management with mosquitoes. It's one of our series. Then we have some case studies, which is really great. But, we were in the middle of the season, and we actually do a lot of surveillance here in New Orleans for arboviruses. And we had the week before Ida, we had positive West Nile mosquito pools. And so what happened was tides go up, right? You get mosquitoes from the marsh as well, from our wetlands. But then we also had our southern house mosquito, which is the main vector of West Nile virus here in our region. So with all the downed trees, and people were also stacking a lot of leaves and vegetation on the curbs. And I remember us looking, and underneath that vegetation was just larvae everywhere. So, we did a lot of larviciding. We were 3 days after the storm, we were working. And a lot of it is like what you had said earlier, is about being prepared. So our building has a full building generator. And at that time for Ida, the power was out across the city. So employees didn't have a place to really go that wasn't oppressive. So we all moved into our building because we had power and air conditioner, and then people started to work. So, every storm is different. Every event is different. But that's the one that is in my head. I don't remember Francine too much, so it probably wasn't that big of an issue.
That's perfect. That's perfect. I just wanted to give, kind of a snapshot of what that emergency looks like as it plays out, and why it's so important to be prepared.
And Richard, let me just tell you one quick thing. Right. It's really about, and for the folks that maybe don't watch the mosquito series, but we have to do rapid abatement, which is adulticides, right, of the adult mosquitoes. Very, very critical. You have to have everything ready to go in the capacity. We happen to have that here. But if you are in a place that you don't have air power, I would say, it's super critical to have all of your contingency contracts done prior to these storms, right? So that everything is laid out. Make sure all your equipment is ready to go, so that you really need to do rapid knockdown. Now, immediately after, each storm is different, right? Mm-hmm. So it's usually going to be that 5 to 7 days after those high tides. Those nuisance mosquitoes are coming out with a vengeance. But it depends on the time of the year. It depends. Everyone's got its little nuance, but the whole goal here is to knock down those adult mosquitoes.
Awesome. Thanks, Claudia. I'll just say, I don't know a lot about bugs and rodents, but I do know what kind of effort Claudia and her team put into their work and what professionals they are. And I can just tell you, we're very lucky here in the city of New Orleans to have Claudia and her team and the type of resources that they have to mitigate these problems for us. So I'm just give you a quick shout out there, Claudia. All right, so real quick here, I just want to give you guys a quick snapshot on BioWatch. Maybe can I just get a show of hands of how many people have heard of BioWatch and know it, or know anything about it? Got one hand there from Claudia. Okay, let's see, not a whole lot of hands past that. Anastasia. Okay, all right. So BioWatch is a federal program that is set up to provide a surveillance system in the cities that it's deployed. It's basically a network of these air sample collectors. They have to, I think there may be some misinformation on one of the slides here. I had some help on this, but they actually set those things up when we have an event. So when we have like a Super Bowl, when we have during Mardi Gras, some of the big events where we know there's going to be a lot of people in a really small space, and especially, we look at the French Quarter and how packed the French Quarter can be during these big festivals and events. That's when we like to just make sure that we're monitoring everything that we can. And so this BioWatch team comes in, they set up this biosurveillance system, and it essentially collects air and samples from that air. They pick them up every night after the mostly crowds have died down, send it for some analysis, and then we can have kind of an early warning layer there, protection in case there was an airborne incident of some sort. A lot of what they do is very similar to the work in style to what you do in vector control. At the end of the day, there's a field collection element. There's an analysis of that material that's been collected, and then at the end of the day, there's protocols that both groups use in order to determine whether or not we have something that is a real threat, and exactly what level of threat it is and what level of management's needed to take care of it. And then that next step, once we've decided that there is a threat, is coordinating with us, the EOC. Okay. That's just a little bit more about kind of that process, of detection, lab confirmation, and then, ultimately leading up to that coordinated response that involves the EOC. And, kind of making sure that you guys understand the big scope of things here. Essentially, we're here for you guys. We're here to make sure that you're trained and planned, and we're here to support that process every step of the way. We need to make these connections ahead of time. And so for those of you are not aware if your department has a connection to the emergency plan, talk to your supervisors. If you are the supervisor and you don't think your office is connected with us, reach out to us. I'm going to leave you some contact information here. And we're on the 9th floor of City Hall. But essentially, we are that connection to this big coordinated effort. The EOC is the room that we operate out of. The ESFs is how we break down the different teams that are involved in the response. The lifelines is where we hold ourselves accountable for keeping people safe. We make sure that we cover those lifelines. And then ultimately, there's your departments out there and the important work that you guys are doing, like BioWatch, like vector control. And that whole group there creates the system that we keep people safe in the city. So this is kind of just 1 through 5 steps how we get you guys trained up. One is you got to identify who's going to be with us in the EOC and who's going to be our point of contact, and let's get connected. Then once we've established that contact, then we get you set up in the right ESF. We get you trained up on ICS and some of the foundational education on working in the EOC. And then we get you integrated with our exercises. We're doing exercises all the time. You guys are welcome to promote an exercise that's maybe a little more particular to your departments, and we'll help you and support you in running that exercise. And then it's all about kind of keeping each other informed and keeping a surveillance or an eye out to any developing incidents, and we communicate together. So this is stuff we encourage you guys to really do as soon as possible. I'm encouraging you to think about it this week while we're talking about it. And it's just important that we get this done now and not during the incident while it's developing. So that's all I got. Questions?
Great.
Concerns?
Yeah, this is really fantastic. You know, I think for me, my first emergency really was Hurricane Katrina. And it was such a learning experience, unfortunately, right? You don't wish that on anyone here, but it was such a learning experience. And I think, you know, some of the information that you presented here today, everybody needs to think about it from their local level, meaning like their household. You know, my documents now are all in one container. Like I even have a piece of hair, like in an envelope, right? Because you see things and it's like, you know, it starts at home. And then you obviously integrated at your department and then city. And Richard, I actually had a question for you. Like, how often are you communicating with other parishes or even other states on emergency management?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's very frequently. We have, as you can imagine, a multitude of committees that are, you know, a little more formally set up so that we keep our information shared. And that's everything from, you know, what are the developing risks or things that we're seeing. You know, there's discussions that we have every year after the hurricane projections come out. You know, we sit down and talk about what our impression of that hurricane projection might be. We have groups that meet informally. You know, the directors of the Region 1 parishes, which is Jefferson, Orleans, Plaquemines, and St. Bernard, meet and have a breakfast or a lunch every couple months, I think it is. The directors do, and that's where they sit down and talk about, you know, what's going on in their particular worlds and comparing notes and information. So it's those relationships that are not only important in developing our plans and making sure that we're aware of the threats out there, but also those relationships that are so clutch when we actually have an incident that maybe we need to help each other out in managing. So it's a great question, though.
I have one more quick question, and just really for the audience, please place your questions in the chat. Stacy is going to go through and see if I missed any. But how often, you know, are, let's say, city employees or even other cities, they come, do you go help at a different event somewhere?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually we do. And there's kind of a system built in for that. Most recently for Hurricane Helene, you know, I don't know if you guys remember that particular hurricane was very unique because it really got through the interior of the states and hit North and South Carolina pretty hard. This is the one that struck Asheville really hard. And so that kind of whole region there was really struggling. And these are places that don't deal with hurricanes very often, so they don't have the teams even to deal with that kind of incident. So they put out kind of an SOS to the other states. There's a system that we use to do that. And you know, knowing that was going on, I was checking my email box, you know, every hour or so to see if a request was coming in. And sure enough, about, you know, 3 or 4 days after the hurricane, which is kind of what we anticipated would happen, those requests start coming in because they realize as this problem is developing, as they're getting eyes on how big the incident is, they realize we can't handle this on our own. So they put that SOS out. They needed an incident management team. So they needed a team just to come in and set up the system to run the incident. And so 5 of us from this office took our command van and some other trucks and some supplies, and we drove to South Carolina, to Spartanburg, South Carolina, where we spent about a week and a half helping them out.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Do you see any, Astacia, that maybe I'm missing? There's some commentary though, saying, what is here? Very purposeful information. Thanks so much for the invitation. Looking forward to this series. So there's some few folks that made some comments. Richard, can you just sort of talk a little bit more about NOLA Ready and how that sort of impacts like the residents, and how do you sign up for it, and what kind of information do you get?
Excellent. That's actually the slide that I missed. Thank you, Claudia. I'm going to make a note. So I'm glad you brought that up. So one important element of our office is how we're broken up. So we have about 15 employees now. We're usually at about 20, 21. We break those folks up into 3 different categories. There's folks that work in our operations section, in our we just actually renamed them. I should use the new names. We have the preparedness section, the response section, and the mitigation section. And so in that preparedness section, we have specifically the NOLA Ready team. And NOLA Ready is our public-facing brand for our office and for our messages about being prepared. And so you guys have probably seen maybe the NOLA Ready texts that come out. If you don't see those NOLA Ready texts that come out, that means you need to sign up for them, because what they are is a system that we use to keep the public informed about what major emergency may be developing, whether it's weather, whether it's you know, the shooting that happened on January 1st. Those kind of incidents are ones that we want to make sure that we've got a route to speak to people in the community to let them know how to be safe and what emergency may be coming towards us and is a threat. So if you don't get those text messages currently, please text NOLA Ready to 77295. It's just NOLA Ready to 77295, and that'll get you signed up. The other route you can do is just go to our website, where you'll see a lot of great information at ready.nola.gov.
Richard, yeah, one more time. So NOLA Ready, what do you text to? I'm putting it in the chat. Sorry, to what's the number?
77295.
All right, so I put it in the chat. And there's a question here from John. Is there a season your team has experienced a breakdown on precise signal about the occurrence, and how did you manage the situation?
You might have to read that question back to me again. I'm not sure I understood.
So John, I think if you're on the line, you can unmute yourself. Or do we have the ability, Astacia? It's
No.
John Nelson. All right, so it says, is there a season your team has experienced a breakdown on the precise signal about the occurrence, and how did you manage the situation? So I'm kind of interpreting that as maybe you didn't get something's coming, you didn't really get the information quickly. How did you manage that?
Yeah, that is a really great question.
Maybe the shooter, seems like that probably happened pretty, the terrorist attack was probably pretty quick.
That would probably be one of the best examples. It's a great question. Is John unmuted now?
He is.
John, you with us? Well, I'm just going to apply what I think was intended with that question to that scenario. What John, I think, is proposing is there situations you get in where you maybe get some initial information, but at that time now where you really want a steady stream of accurate details, it's just not there. And how do you deal with that? One of the terms that we use to describe that scenario is called deconfliction, where we're getting maybe bits and pieces of information and we're not sure what is accurate because the 2 bits don't seem to line up. So we put a great deal of effort into kind of increasing the ways in which we receive information. And so we'll start reaching out to different partners to see what additional details they can do to provide a clearer picture, a clear operating picture. But ultimately, it's one of the probably most difficult situations, especially for those of us in, in leadership when it comes to emergencies, because, we're tasked with deploying resources and looking at ways to solve the problem. And without an accurate operating picture, accurate and clear operating picture, it's very difficult to do that. So I would use that example maybe of January 1st, where there was a lot of information coming out at us. The media was pushing out information, and so we don't necessarily have a lot of methods as the situation's developing outside of listening to our radios and what the operators are saying on the radios, trying to get some information from those incident commanders directly. But they're actively, dealing with that incident. And so getting that information requires us to sometimes be a little creative in how we obtain it. I hope that kind of answers the question. I think I kind of ran around.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
thank you
can
so
hear you,
much,
John.
Thank you so much, sir, for the information. Thank you for the response. I could be able to ask, like, of the training of the officers who are involved in the monitoring situation. Is there they cannot be able to probably if there's a new occurrence, like they are not trained, like a trigger that can come, maybe the refresher how they are done to be able to put them to the current situation. And in the event, like if something happens and they don't really understand how it has maybe evolved to this situation, are they able to record in their reporting? Like if this is not familiar to their exposure, their training, how do they report it for it to be able to be a data that can be able to be understood in the next table? Thank you.
Yeah, that is actually a very great and sophisticated question, actually. So I think I have to kind of turn to my health professionals a little bit on that one, because ultimately, while I mentioned we have systems for recording data, when we get into areas like I think you're alluding to, where it's very specific information that you need in order to determine what type of exposure or what type of threat is maybe developing from an airborne to an infection that can be spread a bunch of different ways. That's information that Claudia, can you help me out on this one? When you get into health, the systems that are used to record and make sure that other people, even outside of our area here, are aware that we're getting funny results or something that we're not used to.
So one of the things that I think health communicators are going to use, it would be a HAN, right? Going through the epidemiologist groups in your Department of Health. So it's a health alert, part of the health alert network. So let's say there's something that is showing up that other physicians, for example, need to know about so that they could diagnose them. It would go through a HAN, for example. So serious things, Zika virus. There was actually in Louisiana, a HAN just went out about murine typhus, and just there were 17 cases in Louisiana with 2 deaths. So it's making folks aware. So everybody handles their data a little bit differently, but if you're trying to get to the masses, that would be just one example of how they would communicate on a larger scale. All right. Somebody asked here again, what's the text number to NOLA Ready? And I believe I put that in the chat. Oh, here it is. You text NOLA Ready, NOLA Ready, to 77295. All right. So if you just check the chat.
That can be kind of confusing to folks, but it's literally like you're sending a text message to the number 77295, and what you're going to send to that number is NOLA Ready.
Great. We do have one question about mosquitoes, right?
Yeah.
Can you describe for us in practical terms a day at the EOC at a public health issue, such as the occurrence of a dengue case in a community. So I'm going to tell you, we have a whole webinar on July 8th that is going to deal with a case study here. Or actually, we've got one on July 1st as well as July 8th. We have actually one of the world experts on this call, Dr. Janet McAllister. And so she's going to be speaking about that, and I'll show the series in a minute. But just in a very nutshell, because we're going to talk about it for an hour, I think for us here in Louisiana, or at least in New Orleans, dengue is not our biggest issue so far. But I'd like to use the example of Zika virus. So that was really a big threat across the southern parts of the United States, where they have Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus mosquitoes. So there was a lot of coordination in the EOC. So the EOC coordinates a lot of different departments, right? So Mosquito and Termite Control is an agency. The New Orleans Health Department is an agency. We also coordinate with the state health department, pest management. Like, there were a lot of different groups that were all working in coordination. So it was really a big response. It cost a little over $1 million. And it was an all boots on the ground scenario, from adulticiding, larviciding, and, we needed to make sure that local transmission wasn't being established. So I can't answer that question, to be honest, in a short period. So what I'm going to really recommend you to do is attend the July 1st and the July 8th. And I think that's going to give you a lot more perspective on really, it's very important to have mosquito control at the table. And it is considered a Category B activity after these storms. All right, so I think that's kind of where we are. I'm going to go ahead and show the agenda real quick for the next series. So Richard, thank you so much today for your time.
Thank you, guys.
I really appreciate it. On June 3rd, we have the role of public health officials. If you've never heard Meredith McInturf speak, she's the New Orleans Health Department. This is about sheltering. It's going to be fantastic. I'm going to be speaking about rodent control at an all hazards event. Talk a little bit about an emergency, like a storm, but also after COVID. What was that? We're talking about pet sheltering as well. And we already mentioned talking about mosquito control and some case studies. So with that, let me just double check if there's any more. Stacey, did you want to talk about any certificates or any CEs to wrap it up?
We're pending CEs for Louisiana sanitarians, so I'll email everyone once I hear back from that department. We're also applying for special CEs for our webinars on July 1st and June 24th with the Louisiana Veterinary Association to get continual education for vets and vet techs and things like that. So we'll email more about that as soon as we get confirmation on that.
Thank you, Astacia. And then also, we're going to be using the same link for all of these sessions, okay? And we'll be sending out reminders as we get closer. So with this, everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. There are a lot of different offerings that are happening. If you are interested in learning more about events sponsored by the Gulf South Vector, please go to vectoroutreach.org. You can sign up to be a subscriber so you get notified by email, but also look under the events tab, and there are many different types of events that are coming up. All right, everyone, thanks so much and have a great day.